So welcome back, hopefully, for those of you who were at our first session, and welcome if you didn't make the first session. But this is the second part of 3 of today's conference on introducing 20-minute neighbourhoods. In case you were at our first session, I'm Fiona Howie and I'm the Chief Executive of the TCPA, and I'm chairing the morning for our event today. And then this afternoon, I will hand over to a colleague from Sport England to chair the afternoon. And just to reiterate, because I know people are asking in the chat, we will share the slides and the recording of the sessions after the event. In our first session, speakers covered what 20-minute neighbourhoods are and why they matter now. And I know we had a good, lots of questions around how it applies to different areas, so urban, rural, suburban, and also questions around the practicalities of actually achieving some of this. So hopefully some of those questions will be picked up by our speakers in this session, and we can certainly pick up some of those themes again, I think, in our Q&A. But this session is an opportunity to hopefully hear about some tools that are available to support the development of complete, compact communities, and some specific case studies where people are trying to make this happen on the ground. As before, there'll be a chance to put questions to our panel. As you'll see, we've got a Q&A after our 3 speakers. So again, please do use the Q&A function. We had over 100 questions to our first panelists. So I will try and get to as many as I can, but inevitably I will probably have to try and pull out themes if I can't ask your specific question, but I will do my best to get through as much as we can. So without further ado, I will hand over to our first speaker in this session, who is Ed Parham. Ed is Space Syntax's Design Director and Head of Innovation. These roles combine the development of techniques and tools to analyse cities with their application to real-world design and planning projects. The overarching objective behind these activities is to create better cities for people by understanding the interactions between urban systems. So welcome, and over to Ed.
Thank you. And just can you just let me know if you can hear everything? Okay, please, Fiona, if you just give me a thumbs up or something. Yeah, great. Okay. So if we can go on to the first slide then, please. Thank you. So Space Syntax, we are an urban design consultancy. We spun out of UCL about 30 years ago. We're employee owned. And what we are really interested in is understanding how the way that we design cities and spaces affects what happens on a daily basis. So if we go into the first slide, please. I think the conversation around 15-minute cities, 20-minute neighbourhoods, 1-minute cities even, is really interesting because it starts to consider outcomes. And I think when we start to think about outcomes, that then raises a set of key questions, because in the past, there have been positive intentions behind the moves that have been made, but they haven't always been delivered. And I think we're in a different position now. What I'm going to talk about specifically is the way that we can use technology to understand how planning and design, and especially planning and design of the big physical systems, the street networks, land uses, densities, public transport, how we can think about designing them in an integrated way to enable positive outcomes. If we go on to the next slide, please. And I think this came up in the first session a little bit. We've got a much better understanding of the way that the environment affects health. And you can see this coming through in a number of different places. The image second on the left was a story on the BBC website a couple of years ago. And it was that people had just saved up to buy their first house, but they were then really unhappy because they spent the whole time in their car driving everywhere, even though they lived very close to a town centre. Next to that, there was some research published by the British Medical Journal, and that identified a lower risk of obesity in people who commuted by public transport. And that was to do with the fact that people are walking each end to get to and from the bus stop or to and from the station. We know that those daily behaviours have an impact on the individual, but they also have a wider impact on society. A paper, I think it's probably the year before last, came out, and that was able to measure that driving actually costs society a certain amount per kilometre, but cycling and walking can actually generate benefits. Now, what we're really interested in at Space Syntax is making models like the image shown on the far left to analyse and understand how those big physical systems fit together, and how that enables or disables daily activities. And ideally, it means that we can understand those outcomes better, and we can then test places before they're designed and avoid these negative outcomes in future. So if we can go on to the next slide, please. So this is the technology we use. It's an approach that we call integrated urban modelling. And this has really become possible over the last 5 to 10 years as a result of the amount of data that's available, improvements in software, improvements in hardware, but also the fact that a lot of people can now code. A lot of graduates finish university and are able to code. And that basically means that we can make bigger, more complicated models with more data sets. And to technical people, maybe that's interesting, that you can make a big model, it's complicated and you can process it quicker. But the really important thing with these models is that if we combine street networks, public transport, land use, we can get the model to provide an answer that you don't need to be an expert to understand, and that makes sense to people that live in a city. So we can start to say, for every house in a city, how many jobs could I get to in half an hour? Can I get to a good school or a good doctor? And there's a whole series of different outputs that we can start to talk about. Can we go on to the next slide, please? So we've made a model of Britain, and this is already starting to give us, this was finished, I think, last September, October, and we've been using this to get some really interesting insights, especially into characteristics of place and how they relate to travel behaviours. Now, we've analysed all the local authorities in Britain, taken their mode share data from census. So we're looking at the share of active public and private travel. And we've been able to analyse that against the physical characteristics of each local authority. And that's considering things like the different levels of physical connectivity of the street network, but also the population and the density. And when we start to analyse all these places, we can start to see where there are conditions associated with certain mode shares. We can see where there might be characteristics that could support a mode shift. We can start to see where there are characteristics that you might want to change to enable that mode shift, but we can also see the scale of that change. And that becomes really important, because it might be that the scale of that change is so big that creating a fundamental mode shift will be really difficult. And actually, it might be better to think about how you can mitigate a condition rather than fundamentally change it. Next slide, please. We worked with Devon and East Devon on one of the NHS Healthy New Towns a few years ago. And as part of that project, we made an integrated model of Exeter and we gave it to the Public Health Department. What we've got in this image on the left is a model of Exeter, and that's showing the walkability, and that's taking every street in the city, and it's starting to look at the mix of land uses within 10 minutes walk of every street, going through the actual street network. So not a crow flies distance, but going through the actual network, and it's including pedestrian routes and cycle routes as well. Now, at that time, we weren't allowed to have access to the health data, but we gave the model to the Public Health Department, and they did some analysis against the data they held, and they were able to identify correlations between obesity and walkability. And what they were finding was that the lower the walkability of the area, so the fewer the land uses you could get to in 10 minutes, the higher the levels of obesity. And this is a really interesting and helpful finding. And it's at this point, it's probably really interesting to say a couple of things about causation and correlation. And just because you can see that there's a correlation, it doesn't mean that you can definitely definitely work to guarantee a positive outcome. If you look at health, health is a really good example because it's complex outcomes that are the result of individual behaviour, demography, socioeconomic factors, but also the environment. You might design a really walkable environment, but somebody could still choose that they, I don't know, drive everywhere and then come home and only eat Mars bars every night, and they'll still be obese, even if they live in the most walkable place. What you can do through design is you can put in place the conditions that allow people to be healthy and active. You can also do the opposite. You can design places the wrong way, and you can make it impossible for people to be active. And that's the thing that I think we need to concentrate on, is not that we can definitely guarantee an outcome, but we can put the conditions in place to make these outcomes possible. If we go on to the next slide, please. We did, last summer, we worked with Knight Frank and the Prince's Foundation. And we took extracts of 10 or 15 different towns and cities around the UK, gave it to Knight Frank, who compared the values that we had in the integrated model against rateable values. And what was really interesting was that that same measure of walkability, which in Exeter was associated with more positive health outcomes, was also associated with higher rateable values. So we're then starting to see an alignment between two long-term outcomes that can support each other. So if you can make a more walkable urban area, you can make it possible for positive health outcomes. And those places also tended to be associated with more positive or higher rateable values as well. On to the next slide, please. So what this means is when we understand how these factors come together, what that means is that we can then start to think about identifying and understanding risk. This image is a model of Milton Keynes, and we're looking at car dependence from every house in the city. We're looking at how many jobs you can get to in half an hour if you've got access to a car, and we're comparing that to how many you can get to if you have got access to public and active transport. So the darker blues are showing you where you can get to at least 5 times more jobs. Now we know we can start to see that that's linked to mode share. So Milton Keynes, it's about a 10% public transport mode share. But one of the really important things that we can start to do, because the model underneath this risk analysis takes the street network, it takes the land use, the density, and the public transport. And that means that we can start to understand why you get these pockets of car dependence, and whether that is because of creating a cul-de-sac neighbourhood, a cul-de-sac layout that increases the distances to things, or maybe it's that there's not a very wide mix of land uses, or maybe that there's no public transport connections nearby. So we can start to identify these pockets, and we can then start to explain what's making them car dependent or not car dependent. Now, if we go on to the next slide, car dependence might not be an issue for people who have got, so if we're thinking about health outcomes, for people who have got time to go to the gym, who can be active, have got the time to be active and make an effort to do so, being car dependent might not be an issue for them. They might have a clean car, it might not pollute, they'll still cause congestion, there'll still be traffic on the road, but they might be able to work around some of those constraints, but it's not the same for everybody. We've got this model is, again, it's zoomed out on Milton Keynes. We're still showing car dependence in blue, but when we make the model, we put it together in a way that we can combine it with census data. And what that starts to mean is that we can see where does the risk of place, or where does place risk overlap with certain socioeconomic or demographic risk. So we could be overlaying it with IMD to see, are there pockets of deprivation which are car dependent. In this image, we've used Age UK publish a risk of social isolation in elderly people model, and that has been run on the census data. And what you can see is the dark grey LSOA areas show the darker the grey, the higher the risk. So you have a population who has the characteristics that are more likely to be older and potentially lonely. And you can use this to identify that combined risk. So are there parts of the city which are more car dependent, and do they have a population who are more likely to be vulnerable living there? Now, if we go on to the next slide, please. So how does this all help us make more walkable and more active places? Some of the things that we know are that if you can bring people close to a wider mix of land uses, that makes it easier to walk. But one of the really important things is the way that the street network works, or the network of streets and pedestrian routes. And what we can start to see is that the street networks that work at lots of different scales at the same time. And what I mean by that is that they overlap different users in the same place at the same time. So if you're walking locally, you might use a certain set of streets. If you're walking across a town or to a different part, when the street network is put together in a certain way, where these different scales of journey overlap in the same place, that creates a more walkable, easier to navigate town or city. And that has a whole series of benefits. If we look at larger cities like London, what that means is that even from the more isolated parts, so from the blue areas in this image, you can walk within 10 minutes to at least 3 or 4 different local centres. And there'll be different hierarchy of centres. Some will be bigger, some will be smaller. But even from these blue areas, which are more isolated, you can get to at least 3 or 4. Now that's important because that gives residents a choice of different services they can access. It gives them a wider choice, but it's also important to the businesses because it gives them access to wider catchment populations. So next slide, please. And I think when we think about the 15-minute city or 20-minute city or even the 1-minute city, what is really good is that I think there's a clear vision and that links to an outcomes, and that can be really helpful to get people on board. But I think the risk of it is that it can sound simple and it can sound like it's easy to deliver. And in reality, we think it's more difficult than that. And we know as well that the problem with towns and cities is that they're big, they're complex, they're slow and expensive to change. And I think the risk is that if we oversimplify design response, or we have a standardized design response to just try to roll out everywhere, the risk is that that could create unintended consequences. And so to understand better about what we should do, I think it's important not just to look at what works, but also to look at what hasn't worked in the past. If we go on to the next slide, please. And I think what we can start to see is that when decisions have been made in the past about focusing very locally and looking only at one scale. So this is an old example, but looking at this idea of creating very small, individually focused neighbourhoods that work for themselves. Prioritizing that local scale of movement without considering how people move between neighbourhoods or move into the centre of a town or a city, that can have negative impacts, and that can be exacerbated if big pieces of infrastructure are working at a different scale. The result is that you end up with fragmented places. It's more difficult to be active and people can become car dependent. And I know this is a slightly old example, and I know that people recognise that there are problems with this type of development and we're trying to move away from it, but it is still being followed on a very large scale internationally, especially if we look at the really rapidly growing places in the Middle East or China. This inward looking pockets of development separated by big pieces of infrastructure is still being followed in a big way. So if we can go on to the next slide, please. I think the important thing is that thinking about what we can do to enable positive outcomes, I think the starting point, which is really important, is to start to talk about long-term outcomes, not outputs, and to move on from that kind of the short impact conversation. If you see stories in the press, often they focus on the cost of something or the number of houses that are being delivered. I think what's really important is to push that agenda, or change that story so that it begins to be focused on how healthy people are in 10 years' time, or how happy they are, how much carbon is emitted. It's really the impacts of what it's like to be there. And to do that, it's probably easier said than done. To do that, what we need to start to do is be thinking a more integrated and a strategic way, to bring together departments and specialists at a high level around shared data. So bringing together planning, people have mentioned highways departments a couple of times, planning and highways and public health, to have them around the same table, talking about the same things at the same time is really important. We can use technology and data to learn from places that work, and then we can start to develop shared strategies, and we can then define more detailed projects that can be coordinated within those shared strategies. And the particular response that we might make will depend on exactly where you are and what's happening. So if we were looking at designing a new place from scratch or a major extension, we can design those places better now because we can learn from the places that enable those outcomes, and we can look at how you structure the street networks, land uses, densities, all those things. We can make sure those characteristics are in place from the beginning. In places where you don't have that same amount of growth, you can analyze and understand how existing places work. Now, you might be able to find pockets that already have the underlying characteristics in place, and you can then start to improve or intensify those areas. But not everywhere is growing or has those kinds of those levels of investment available. So in some places it might be you can't change it, but we can still think spatially, and we can start to use technology to understand where there are risks of place risk, essentially, where there are pockets that are isolated, where there are car dependent places. And then we can think about where are the vulnerable populations and consider how to mitigate the impact of living in those particular places. which might be through a soft intervention. It might not be through changing the physical environment. It might be around prioritizing the delivery of a particular service to that population in that area. So the summary really is to say that we have technology that allows us to better understand how the built environment affects day-to-day activity. And what that means is that we can tailor particular interventions to the specific characteristics of location and place. And I'll hand over now, hand back for the next talk. So thank you.
Many thanks, Ed. Really interesting stuff, and I'm sure we'll pick it back up in the Q&A. But now I will pass over to our next speaker, who is Paul Clement. Paul is Chief Executive of Locus Management Solutions, which operates the Ipswich Central Business Improvement District and the All About Ipswich Destination Marketing Organisation. He has considerable experience in the reshaping of places, having established his own consultancy in 2011, which was then acquired by Savills in 2018. So welcome, Paul, and over to you.
Thank you very much, and good morning, everybody. I'm delighted to be here. Ipswich is thrilled to be part of this network and also to have contributed to your guide that has been released today. As Fiona has said, I'm Chief Exec of Ipswich Central and All About Ipswich, and I'm therefore, during this session, hopefully going to answer Mickey Aronson's question in the chat, which is, what is the contribution that bids and DMOs can make to this theory? The other thing to understand is that I and my organisation very much come at this from the business perspective. We represent 650 businesses in our town centre, plus 100 others that are members of the DMO outside the town centre, and therefore anything that we do has got to be right for business. So next slide, please. So this is Ipswich from the air. You are looking northwards. So in the south, we have a stunning waterfront marina, and I'll show you that in just a second. But to the north, you've got the old town centre where retail and commerce primarily was conducted. We launched in 2015 a vision project with our partners to physically turn the town around so that we connected the old town centre with this new waterfront. And if we go to the next slide, we'll show you why that was important. This is Ipswich's waterfront. As a lad in Ipswich, I was always told never to go to the industrial port, but today this is where everybody wants to be and everybody wants to be seen. And it's filled with new homes, but also businesses. Our university is based down there. We've got a high quality hotel, and it really is rather stunning. And Ipswich has, as a result, become very much a tourist destination. Next slide. But if you go back, not quite to my school days, but it's not far off. This is Ipswich's history. Ipswich is a port. It was a big industrial port. That's where the employment was based, and it's why the town slowly built around that port. And what actually happened over a period of time was that we created barriers between the port and the waterfront and the main commercial core, and actually the two were just not connected. So next slide. In 2015, therefore, and most recently again, we looked at how do you create a vision for a place, and we understood that you had to go backwards in order to move forwards. You had to understand the history of the place. Where does your place come from? And as I've said already, that for Ipswich is its waterfront location. So that's the historical aspect. The physical aspect is to work out how does it actually function, how does it work, or indeed how does it not work. And some of those barriers that we built between the waterfront and the town centre blocked walking and cycling routes, and we needed to open those up again. And then the third and the more important bit is, so how do people feel about it? And is what you're doing restoring a greater sense of local pride? And places, and the narrative of places, is built up by the stories that people tell to one another about the place. And therefore we needed to make sure that those stories were moving forward in a positive way. Next slide. Our great strength in Ipswich is that in 2015 we formed a solid local leadership called the Ipswich Vision. It's made up of our MP, our Borough and County Council, our LEP, our Chamber of Commerce, our university, which is based on the Waterfront, and also the two organisations that I'm responsible for. And also introduced into that periodically throughout has been the Ministry of Housing, Community and Local Government, which has ensured that we've received funding to progress some of the ideas that we've got. So even though individuals might change, these organisations have stayed solid, worked together, adopted the same vision, and now with the Connected Town principle, this principle will be adopted within local policy. Next slide, please. So this is our updated vision. I don't expect you to read all of this, but we have built the vision around the town centre being usable, livable, vibrant and differentiated, and around this connected principle. We steered away from the use of 15-minute, 20-minute, 1 minute, and actually we got stuck in the weeds on that a little bit, with people saying it's a bit less than 15 minutes or it's a bit more than 10 minutes, and connected for us describes what it is we are trying to achieve. Next slide. Next slide. And Ipswich is a connected town, has always been a connected town, given its location on the East Coast and its connections through to Europe. It's 50 minutes away from Stansted, it's an hour away from London. You know, central to the way our town operates is connections. So actually that word really means something locally. So next slide. Some of the speakers earlier stole my thunder on this, which is we can all feel very good about this and pat ourselves on the back and say we've come up with a big, brave new idea, 15 minutes, 20 minutes connected or whatever, but actually we would be kidding ourselves. Really, what we're doing is going back to the historical meaning of place. So go back to the Greek agora, a big public square built in Greek cities around which sat business, commerce, politics, residential. If you wanted to go and see a doctor or a medic, you went to the agora. That was the place you wanted to go to and be seen in. So gathering, density, proximity, diversity goes right back to the root of urban centres. Next slide. And I've picked 3 individuals here, but we could probably pick 100. You know, I could have picked Ebenezer Howard, who was referred to earlier with the Garden City principles. But I've picked Clarence Perry, who in the early 1900s did some work in New York, building neighbourhoods around a city that suddenly had found a car imposed on its highways, and how that disorientated and fragmented the city. And a lot of his neighbourhoods were, as has already been said, built around schools and education, and from there the other services that people needed. You could refer to Jane Jacobs in the 1960s and building cities or renewing cities during a period of suburbanisation, but from the bottom up, from the people that would be the residents, the people that would be the users, rather than plonking buildings in and expecting us to use it. Or you can go to Carlos Marino, whose much publicised work recently in Paris has hit the headlines. But let's be clear here. Some experts are saying he or they have invented the 15-minute city. They haven't, and he's never claimed that he has. Next slide, please. So in Ipswich, we've had periods of decentralisation and centralisation. And with COVID, we're in a not unique position, because most cities and towns around the country are in this position whereby we're seeing a certain hollowing out as retail starts to close or at least retract. We're still, though, seeing demand for people wanting to live in the centre. And therefore, what we have struck upon is we simply have to change. The market will not recover this for us. Next slide. We have been badly hit by COVID, no worse than most other places, but we, at the moment, if all of our units were open, we've got a 14% vacancy rate. Probably though, and our biggest opportunity, and if you look at this street, this is our secondary shopping street, we've probably got 40% of the built floor space in our town unused. And there is something fundamentally wrong with our leasing principles in this country, where you have to let all of the floors to a unit like Waterstones, but actually they can't make use of all of those floors and they sit vacant. So we think there's an opportunity, not just from the buildings that are vacant, but to start to use bits of buildings that are not used, or alternatively, land that could be developed. Next slide. And therefore, one of the things that we've done in producing the principles of the connected town is started to look up rather than across the street. And actually, Ipswich is a beautiful historic town. And these buildings were houses. They were never intended to be ground floor shops or offices. They were intended to be homes. And we've got to go back to history to start to reinvent ourselves. Next slide. So this is Ipswich from the air again, and you will see that if you live in the centre of Ipswich, you can get on the right-hand side to the waterfront, or on the left-hand side to the station, or in the north to the very splendid Christchurch Park, and to everything in between, easily walking it in 15 minutes. So on either end of this, picking up on some of the work done around schools, the university and the college and a brand new school is being built on the right-hand side, the east, and an existing school and education complex on the left-hand side. Those form the bookends of this area. And then you've got the leisure aspects of the waterfront in the south and the park in the middle. What we're having is this hollowing out in the middle, which we're absolutely determined now we can turn around. So next slide. The principles then of the connected town are: more people will be living centrally and having around them all that they need to live their lives locally. That doesn't mean that we're taking out an opportunity for business. What it means is we're adding a different kind of user for businesses, and we will attract different kind of businesses in, or different kind of operators in, to fulfill this connected town concept. So medical centres, libraries, more markets, more educational facilities, etc., etc. Though it is not just about building homes. Next slide, please. But the connected town concept doesn't lose Ipswich's ability to reach beyond its borders. And we therefore know that the town's got to be better connected with its beautiful rural hinterland. And some of these locations that sit, for example, 15 minutes drive time around to us, that is our logical future catchment for a very different kind of town centre. Next slide. But we're also committing to spend significant sums of money on 11 district shopping centres. So as more of our residents start to hybrid work, partly in the town centre and partly from home, we want their neighbourhood centres to have the same connected feel. Everything that they want around them when they're working from home, in exactly the same way as everything around them when they may be working in an office in the town centre. And next slide, extending the hybrid working theme, we are only an hour, and will shortly be less than an hour away from London. We think there's a huge opportunity for people who will commute and work in London less, will be prepared to commute further to live in a different kind of environment. And therefore, if Ipswich Town Centre can give them everything they need to live their life locally, then working in Ipswich Town Centre 2 days a week and from your desk in London 3 days a week, that sounds like a pretty splendid way of living your life. So next slide. So the things we're committing to are new kinds of living and working, but not just desk-based service type industry. We think there's an opportunity to bring in light industry, manufacturing, people living over their shops, more growth in independent retailers and so on. We actually see a growth in business, not a retraction of it. Next slide. During the COVID period, the government has given us the ability to close streets and create new walking routes, and that's allowed us to explore some of the routes that maybe should be connecting the waterfront with the town centre, but actually now we're committing to start to pedestrianise those streets and turn them into spaces that people can move more freely. And next slide. And we've got some public space projects sitting around some of our streets where residential will form part of it, but actually we know we've just got to create a much better environment for people to be. Next slide. But this isn't about anti-car. In Ipswich, if we propose this as being about driving the car out, we wouldn't be able to carry the public with us. So actually what it's about is about rebalancing the relationship between the car and the pedestrian, the cyclist, and those that want to live there and live their lives well. So we know we've got to open up new routes, north-south, down to the waterfront and back to the town centre, and that's going to cut across what are currently quite busy roads, and we've got to be brave enough to do that. So how do we afford all of this? So next slide. Just over a week ago, we won £25 million from MHCLG in the town fund process. So I'm not going to pick on all of these, but we've got 11 projects, all consistent with the Connected Town principle. We're going to spend £2.8 million on the shopping parade that I talked about out of town. We're going to spend £600,000 on new greening and creating greener walkways and cycling routes. We've got £8 million in a revival fund to start to unlock problem sites, problem buildings where we know we can build new homes. And importantly, we've got £2.3 million to spend on digitalising the town centre so that people don't feel that jar between being able to sit at home and shop and actually experience with their mobile device something really different and really much better when they're in the place. So next slide. And although these will be the features of our connected town as we move through the coming months and years, there is one key thing which we think a connected town is a great proposition for somebody who might be coming to visit us, to stay here for a weekend. If you can get out at the station and be within 15 minutes of everything you need, theatres, cinemas, shops, restaurants, and indeed your hotel, that is a great visitor proposition. Next slide. So what happens next? Well, we've got a strategy, we've got a concept. We're about to go out to public engagement and public consultation, asking our residents and our businesses, what is it that you need in your town centre to live there, live better, or trade better? So we're committed to the project, and what we're now going to do is build a shopping list of the other bits and pieces we need on the end of the town fund so that we can actually start to implement this with speed. Next slide. And this kicks off on the 13th of April, and I'm extending an invite to everybody on this call. We're holding a short conference, hour and a half, which will explain what's happened in town and city centres during COVID, but also what we're going to be doing to try and create a new style town centre. You can book on that, it's free of charge. Go to ipswichcentral.com. And you will be able to book your space, and we'd love to see you. So thank you very much, next slide, for listening. I look forward to taking part in the Q&A, and as I've said before, we're really proud to be here. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Paul. I think certainly suggesting from the chat that it's really helpful to hear how an existing place is trying to use this concept and what you've done with it. And as you say, we'll pick up some of your comments in the Q&A. But our third and final speaker for this session will talk about how the concept can be applied to new places. So hopefully that will be a really interesting complementary point to raise. And then as we say, we'll come back. Just a reminder, please do use the Q&A function for questions. But our third and final speaker for this session is Simon Pugh, who is the urban design partner at David Locke Associates. Simon has worked for over 30 years within private urban design and architectural consultancies, and has developed a broad range of master planning skills and expertise, ranging from large-scale strategic master planning to design concepts and layout plans for discrete parcels of land. Notably, he's led significant large-scale master planning projects, including the Milton Keynes 2050 Strategic Growth Study, and he's also actively involved, perhaps at the other end of the spectrum in terms of scale, in custom and self-build homes sector. So welcome, Simon, and over to you.
Thank you very much. Next slide, please. So in my presentation, I'm going to use some illustrated examples of compact neighbourhoods. Firstly, a conceptual place, then a new place, and finally an example from abroad that I visited. Lots of plans, illustrations, images for you to see, but please ask any questions in the Q&A at the end. Next slide, please. DLA were commissioned to undertake a strategic growth study for Milton Keynes, examining options for the growth of the new city to 2050. The study was based on answering a number of exam questions around how to accommodate borough population doubled to around 500,000 people, how to deliver a fit-for-purpose city-scale mobility strategy, and how to design new and regenerated places which ensure existing as well as new communities benefit from new growth and investment. Having lived in MK for 40 years and with our office based in central Milton Keynes, local knowledge has been invaluable in translating best practice around creating healthy, connected, prosperous neighbourhoods into an MK context. Next slide, please. A fundamental component underpinning the future growth of MK is a proposed rapid transit network for the greater MK area, not just facilitating the proposed growth, but providing mobility benefits for existing residents and businesses. The main focus of today's conference is clearly the 20-minute neighbourhood, but it's also very important to recognise that wider connectivity via transit is also required at the city scale. Next slide, please. The framework for growth isn't a one-size-fits-all expansion of the MK grid. Whilst there are opportunities immediately adjacent to complete and expand the grid, there are also opportunities for rail-based growth or intensification around existing or potential new stations. Milton Keynes uniquely sits at the intersection of the West Coast Main Line and East-West Rail lines at the heart of the Oxford to Cambridge Arc. Opportunities for new transit-based communities outside of the current urban area, some even beyond the borough boundary into neighbouring authorities. There are also opportunities for growth within the existing built-up area, whether that be significant intensification within the central area, redevelopment around key rapid transit nodes and centres, or through estate renewal. Next slide, please. Milton Keynes is world renowned for its network of strategic green spaces. Another key component of the study was the further expansion of this network to help shape and connect existing and new neighbourhoods through green infrastructure. Next slide, please. Providing a little more focus given today's subject matter, here are some more details looking specifically at the new transit-based communities. This is a conceptual neighbourhood applicable to a variety of contexts. It assumes a critical mass of at least 5,000 homes, which will support the key required community infrastructure, such as secondary school, doctor's surgery, and rapid transit catchment population. Next slide, please. Breaking down the various components of the new neighbourhood, an integrated and segregated network of cycleways, giving access to all key destinations within the development, as also to the wider area of Milton Keynes. Providing for vehicular access internally to and from the wider area, but not necessarily providing for local journeys that should be provided by walking or cycling. Integrating a dedicated rapid transit corridor, providing walkable 400 and 800 metre catchments for main hub and local stops. Locating commercial and community uses within hubs adjacent to transit stops, and emphasising the importance of integrated and connected network for green infrastructure. Next slide, please. This image illustrates the art of the possible when designing new transit-based neighbourhoods, integrating the rapid transit system right into the heart of the development, benefiting from integrated ticketing systems and real-time information. The broad principle being applied is that services during peak hours in particular are frequent enough not to need a timetable, just turn up and go. Next slide, please. Particularly in the Milton Keynes context, with MK having a cycle network known locally as Redways, cycling is given even more priority in the heart of the neighbourhoods, an emphasis to encourage active travel, particularly for local trips. However, it's just as important that the associated infrastructure is also provided, secure racks for bike storage and opportunities for hire. Next slide, please. For the private vehicles we do continue to own and will be EV powered into the future, we must ensure that charging needs are also met. Community car clubs will also hopefully be a key component of our neighbourhoods going forward, providing the opportunity for car ownership to be reduced instead hiring a vehicle when needed. Next slide, please. Ensuring that a network of green spaces are provided and that key urban spaces, such as here at the heart of the neighbourhood, are of the absolute highest quality. Next slide, please. A finer grain mix of uses and flexibility within buildings needs to be provided. This has proved vital in recent times and is very likely to be an important component of neighbourhoods going forward, especially support for home working and serviced office and meeting space, such as WeWork. Higher density mixed use, mixed tenure residential will also be important, adding vibrancy to the heart of the place and benefiting from access to services and supporting the viability of transit services. Next slide, please. MK is currently dominated by car-borne travel, with its high-speed and capacity network of grid roads, offering easy cross-city movement. Pre-COVID, this was already changing, with peak hour pinch points emerging with significant queues forming. Even for Milton Keynes, that is very significant. Without intervention, the current situation cannot accommodate current planned growth to 2030 or around 2030. This series of images was designed to engage councillors to think about why the move to rapid transit in MK is needed, rather than focusing on EV or autonomous cars going forward. They take exactly the same amount of space as the cars that we all use today. Next slide, please. Following few slides show a couple of examples of how the rapid transit system could be integrated into the existing grid corridors. Here's one of the key dual carriageway grid roads. Next slide, please. And here you will see the repurposing of one of the carriageways for transit, introducing a stop at the intersection with local streets and where existing roadways converge, providing convenient access for neighbourhoods on both sides. Reduced road space for vehicles and corresponding speed limits, down from 70 miles an hour for the dual carriageway that is there at the moment, to around 30 to 40 miles an hour, will also enable the possibility of grade controlled crossings. But this will certainly be a point of discussion locally. Next slide, please. Second example is a single carriageway grid road corridor, benefiting from the reserve space within the corridor and adjacent undeveloped reserve sites set out by the Milton Keynes Development Corporation. Again, at the intersection with a local route, which in this instance is in the form of one of Milton Keynes' many underpasses. Next slide, please. The segregated transit corridor utilises the corridor reserve land, retaining the strong and important landscaping in the main. The adjacent reserve sites offer opportunities for higher density development forms, benefiting from this direct access to the new transit system. This example is also adjacent to an existing neighbourhood centre, which will benefit from improved accessibility, potential for expansion and additional catchment. Next slide, please. Reprioritising intersections between roads and redways, allowing cyclists to make uninterrupted journeys. Next slide, please. And reimagining the iconic central Milton Keynes boulevards. Next slide, please. DLA had a long-standing lead role in the master planning delivery of the southern expansion of Peterborough, a new community totalling 8,000 homes at the Hamptons and a further 5,300 at Great Haddon, adjacent to the south. The second of the planned neighbourhoods at the Hamptons is Hampton Vale. Next slide, please. These images show the progression over time from the former brick pit brownfield site to the planned new neighbourhood around 1,800 homes. This slide shows the first residential phase underway and the development brief for the western phase of the neighbourhood. Around 1 million cubic metres of material was recontoured to provide for the development, all in the context of Europe's largest great crested newt reserve to the west. The 1993 outline planning consent conditions required development briefs to be produced for each neighbourhood, with further design briefs being produced to help drive design quality. These tools provided the required certainty for all parties, balancing quality and ability to deliver on site. Pre-recession, Hampton was delivering 450 dwellings per annum. Next slide, please. The latest Google images show the layout and design of the new neighbourhood was constructed on site exactly as planned, with all the structuring elements, streets, green and blue infrastructure, and key community facilities designed to create a walkable and legible place, with a centre of activity at its very heart. Next slide, please. The neighbourhood is focused around a mixed-use centre, you can see. Next slide, please. Ground floor flexible commercial frontages. Next, please. The primary school, delivered at an early stage and immediately becoming a focus for daily activity within the neighbourhood. Next slide, please. A community building later in the programme, but designed to complement other local centre uses. Next, please. The lakeside pub, benefiting from the afternoon and evening sun, an aspect overlooking the lake. Next, please. And local play spaces included at the heart of the neighbourhood, connected to the wider green infrastructure. Next slide, please. A few photos of the completed development: apartments above commercial uses at ground floor, the community building, the primary school, and allotments, delivered as a key component of each of the Hampton's neighbourhoods and proven very popular actually over the lifetime of the development so far. Interesting fact, the first allotments club became the first residents association, who then lobbied to become the Hampton's Parish Council. Local governments literally grown from the ground up. Next slide, please. And lastly, the third example is from Houghton, located to the southeast of Utrecht. I was lucky enough to go there on a study tour in 2019, was pretty blown away by the quality of the place that was being created. Next slide, please. At around 45,000 population, it's a significant planned growth location. It was designed around the existing rail line and as a station at the heart of each of its two neighbourhoods. You'll see that catchments from the stations themselves are walkable and certainly cyclable. Each neighbourhood has a mixed-use centre at its heart and a variety of employment locations easily accessible by all modes. Next slide, please. Within each neighbourhood, walking and cycling is given absolute priority. You'll see the distributor road is pushed to the edge of the development, providing for vehicular access to and from Houghton, but discouraging car movements within the two neighbourhoods for local trips. Next slide, please. With car movements focused on the edge of the development, all the key desire lines to the central neighbourhoods hubs are provided by the extensive network of cycle routes, with local bus transit also benefiting from priority from within the neighbourhoods themselves. The survey results for residents' mode of travel illustrates the scale of modal shift achieved for local journeys within these neighbourhoods. The lighter green at the top of the graph is the car-based journeys, and very much in the minority, even for grocery shopping. Next slide, please. A few images illustrating the level of integration and priority for active travel modes, a highlight of which for me was a secure, well-lit and very well used covered cycle parking right below the station platforms themselves. Interchange really doesn't get much better than this. Next slide, please. Generally, it's also a really attractive place to be, well designed and high quality homes everywhere, and no visible differences between the various tenures. Active centres that provide for all day-to-day needs and exceptional high quality of maintained public realm, green and blue infrastructure. If you or your colleagues are looking for a study tour location or even a busman's holiday, then I would heartily recommend Houghton and Utrecht. The examples I've shown, it's evident that each neighbourhood has been designed to reflect its local context, catchment, population and mobility characteristics. Nevertheless, there are some core components which drive successful neighbourhoods, and these reflect the key features of the TCPA 20-minute neighbourhood guidance being launched today. And with that, I will hand back to Fiona. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Simon. So if I could ask our panel members for this session to please put their cameras back on. Thank you very much. And we will cover some questions. I should just reiterate, please do use the Q&A function. We've got lots of questions, which is great, but definitely some emerging themes. So if I could ask Ed, perhaps we've had some quite specific questions about the model that you talked about. So perhaps if I come to those first, and then we'll pick up some more of the general themes. But if you, as people will know from the first session, there were quite a lot of questions around how does this apply in rural areas? This is just an urban concept. And so perhaps unsurprisingly, there's been some similar questions around the space syntaxis model. So are there any examples of suitable applications of the model in rural areas? And then also perhaps around, have there been any exercises carried out that assess the interrelationships between villages and hamlets and perhaps market towns?
Yeah, okay, so we've made a model of the whole of Britain. We've got, there's a few different, well, there's two different versions. There's one which is made just from open data, and that is available to anybody to use. I can post a link in the questions, because I think that picks up there was another question about being able to access things as well. We originally made that model for some work with the Government Office for Science, probably about 4 or 5 years ago, and it was looking at understanding implications of growth scenarios at a national scale. And it was trying to understand what are the relationships between cities of different sizes, how do cities fit together, how do regions work, how do towns and villages work together. So one of the things that came out from that work was that if you look at Britain, you get this really interesting pattern where southeast is basically dominated by London. If you're within probably about, if you were to draw a kind of diagonal line, within about 100 kilometres of London, you don't tend to get cities bigger than Oxford or Cambridge. But once you get outside of that, you get different patterns developing. And I mean, you can start to see things. There was a ring of smaller, medium-sized cities around the Peak District, where the cities are smaller, but they're closer and they're better connected. But you can also start to see where you might get small cities or medium-sized cities with a network of supporting towns and villages. And so we can start to use that analysis. We can see a whole hierarchy of towns and settlements and cities across the country, and we can start to see the relative strength of them and how they fit together to make networks that support each other. So we have done work around those areas. A lot of our work tends to be looking within cities about how will cities grow, or how will a master plan in this part of a city affect what happens, and how will it be affected by what's happening around there.
Thank you, Ed. And just one technical question that somebody asked. I know you talked about your model isn't about as the crow flies, it's about actual journeys, but somebody asked if it takes into account topography, recognizing that hills might either put people off or slow people down.
Yeah, so to begin with, it's possible to do that. In the models that we make, which are the really big scale models, we don't include that. One of the things that you tend to find is that the street networks that have emerged over time will tend to take the least steep routes anyway. So in some ways, the natural hierarchy that's within the street grid will take the less flat routes. If you've got a choice between two routes and one is steep and one's not, people will use the one that's less steep. We've got a way of weighting the streets according to that, but we haven't used that on the kind of national scale models. The other point to clarify is that those models are really looking at the big, large scale systems. And what's really important is that you get in place those street networks. And once those things are in place, then making places walkable or encouraging activity begins to be questions around public realm and the quality of the actual environment itself. And so there's a whole kind of series of different layers that need to be in place to make walkable places. For us, the most important one is the big bits of infrastructure, which once they're there, they're probably not going to change for hundreds of years, if not more. Once they're right, then you can do the public realm, street lighting, all of those things, and it all needs to work together, essentially.
Thank you. And Paul, I know you mentioned that as part of the work in Ipswich, you recognise that there needs to be better connection to the rural hinterland, and you also made the link to London. Again, earlier and then again in the Q&A for this session, people have been asking about the suburbs and the rural fringe, and it's the importance of them being able to access town centres. So I just wondered if you might be able to reflect a little bit more on Ipswich's work on that, around what within your vision, what does that look like? How is the concept really working to make that better connection?
You've probably got two tiers to that. So if you go beyond the town centre but stay within the borough boundary, as I said in my presentation, we've got 11 district centres, which obviously large residential developments, complexes are gathered around. So I've already talked about how we are going to connect them in both to the concept and back into the town centre. Beyond Ipswich, Ipswich's greatest asset is Suffolk. Suffolk is an incredible county. I've lived here all my life. I've run businesses all around the country, but I've always stayed in Ipswich because I genuinely love it. So I think that the bit that the London bit, we get how we can capitalise on that. But we need to encourage our rural neighbours to engage with us in a different way. The difficulty with that is it's very complex political networks. So we've got a gathering of different political networks sitting around as various authorities. So what I'm talking about really is within the borough boundary and reaching out to London and reaching out, but it's for them really to decide how they reach back in again. But what I can say is we're open to working with them.
Okay, thank you. And we've just had I think related to that, Simon, you really usefully showed us some international examples, I think, which is very positive. And someone's asked, to what extent the Utrecht concept can work in England with our hills and valleys.
I mean, the application of the principles that I saw in Houghton, many of those have been applied to the work in Milton Keynes. yeah, the lie of the land is fundamental. I think it's absolutely particular to the making sure that developments are in relation to their context, fundamentally important. But yeah, I think the rail example clearly would provide challenges given the lie of the land, as you say. The vast majority of the Netherlands is extremely flat. Much of the UK is not. But whether it's rail or whether it's bus, I think it's about the quality of the transit option and the opportunity that is provided at the heart of the neighbourhood. And again, linking it back to today's sessions, is getting the heart of the mixed use centre with its transit options and ensuring that they're connected into a wider network.
Thank you. Again, similar to our first session, we've had quite a few questions around the potential impact of planning reform, both in terms of what was in the planning white paper, but also actually the changes that government is already making or proposing to the existing system. So one for you, Paul, perhaps in the first instance, but people are asking about how the vision for Ipswich is making, what links are being made to the local plan, and then, are there concerns about the potential for permitted development rights to either help or hinder the implementation of that vision?
Absolutely. So let me deal with those 2 points separately. In terms of local policy, I've said this has been adopted by all of the key partners, and the local plan sits with our local borough council. So all of the partners have adopted the concept as the strategy for the development of the town centre, and they will be amending their own plans and the local plan to reflect it. So I'm confident that that bit's okay. Permitted development, is 2 sides of a coin. One side is huge opportunity in that it is bureaucracy free, red tape free. You can carry out conversion fairly quickly. The flip side of the coin, the criticism of it, is that it is therefore unpoliced, unregulated, and leads to low quality housing. And actually, I think the intervention in that, if this does become the way that things move, is the local leadership and the guidance. So let me give you a very specific example in Ipswich. We've got a street called Car Street, which is the progression of the so-called golden mile of retail. I mean, frankly, between you and I, Fiona, who the hell came up with that phrase, God knows, but a so-called golden mile of retail. But it had within it 3 large stores. It has Sports Direct, it had Woolworths, remember them, and it had a co-op store. So actually the whole street was built around those 3 big blocks. And then at the end was developed a cinema. So we can leave that street or we can intervene. And what we're going to do is intervene. So we're intervening by cinema is now a church. The department store is being demolished, and that's where a school is being built. Sports Direct have acquired premises in the very centre, and that's what we want other retailers to do, to cluster around the centre. And then actually, if we've got the will and the funding, and the Revival Fund gives us that, to intervene, it may well be occasionally we have to guide planning and principle. Occasionally, though, we may actually have to intervene and buy, which we've done before. So it'll be a combination of those 2. I think the biggest thing that's changed, and probably over the last 10, 20 years, is we used to wait for the market to do this for us. It'll be fine because there'll be another retailer along. The market is not going to restore it this time. So you either intervene or you allow your place to wither on the vine.
Really interesting that you've had to intervene, I think. Simon, I wondered if there were any reflections in terms of the points you were raising in your presentation around the potential benefits or disbenefits of planning reform.
I think looking at the Milton Keynes final strategy that the council have adopted, they've actually adopted it as a corporate vision document rather than necessarily a planning document. So quite a different approach to generating a think piece, basically, to inform their strategy, particularly the scale of the development, the length of time of which doubling the size of the city will take. It goes beyond 1, probably even 2 plan periods into a third. And so there is really no framework for that. It's very difficult for that thinking to go on at the moment. So the adopted strategy document at the moment just provides part of the evidence base that goes into feeds into the production of the next local plan, of which Milton Keynes is embarking on in the next year or 2.
But actually, sorry, if I can come there, Simon, yeah. That's really important though, because places like Milton Keynes and you know, I would argue in Ipswich, have done the strategy first, and not for everybody is a 20-minute neighbourhood, a 15-minute city the right strategy. I don't think anybody is saying it's right for everybody, but at least we're doing the strategy first rather than immediately delving into the detail and worrying about individual streets and buildings. If you get everybody locked behind a strategy, then it's easier to deliver the rest. And Simon, I think it's interesting that Milton Keynes have done it that way, and good on them.
And I think picking up on that theme around that sort of strategy and getting everybody behind it, there's been some questions about how you do that. How do you get developers on board? How do you get local politicians on board, as well as, of course, the community, the business owners, the residents? So, Paul, perhaps, you know, could you tell us a little bit about sort of how have you taken people with you in Ipswich?
Well, we're not going to consult or engage on the strategy as such. You know, we're locked into this. We think this will work. We're going to make it happen. What we are going to engage on is, okay, so how do we implement that at a local level? You know, where should the residential developments be? What should the sites be that we need to unlock or bring forward? Which streets need to be pedestrianised, or whatever. We're going to engage both businesses and residents, I think often with local authority consultations. Sorry, I'm just going to upset half your audience here. It's very orientated towards those that don't like stuff, and actually only to residents. And we want to make sure that this is opened up to residents, commuters, visitors, and businesses as well, but with a really positive engagement behind it, not be against it. Tell us how you want us to make it work. And we're absolutely committed to a summer-long, as wide as possible engagement process, but what it's not going to do is throw us off the strategy. The strategy is the strategy. It's now about implementing it.
Okay, thank you. And Simon and Milton Keynes, you know, again, how has the sort of galvanised support around the work that's been done?
I think during the production of the strategy, there was a lot of engagement carried out by the council with the various parish councils. In the main, I think, was the key engagement, but there were particular stakeholder groups and developer groups who were engaged with as well. As has been mentioned, engagement at this level, at such a significant scale of development, is always really quite difficult. But I think one of the things that the council felt was very positively responded was the approach of integrated growth. As I mentioned in my presentation, it's not just edge blobbing or growth on the edge of Milton Keynes to provide the homes which are needed. It's very much about the scale of the growth, looking over a longer term. What are the key components that the whole city needs to do the growth really well, you know, good growth. And again, to come back to the transit system in Milton Keynes, such a fundamental shift from a car-borne, car-based place at the moment. And there were some interesting discussions about whether that is right. And many of the residents of Milton Keynes love their cars and want to continue to be able to use it. And again, going back to the graphics which I showed in my presentation, it was having to educate residents and councillors and members to say that you can't just carry on with the current situation and double the population. You know, everything just falls over in terms of the infrastructure. So with the foresight of, you know, a longer term view, enables you to really think about what the solutions are to ensure that, you know, you avoid those pitfalls.
Can I add something?
Yes, do come in,
which is that I think one of the issues that comes up is that if what I think the conversation around the time is slightly irrelevant, but the size of the city and the idea that we're talking about outcomes. And I think what's really interesting is the shift towards being outcome focused. I think there then becomes a really interesting question, which is actually who decides those outcomes that we're trying to deliver. And some of those things will come from national policy, where we're committed to reducing carbon emissions and doing a series of other things. But I think if you look at where things have been difficult or divisive in the last year or so, is especially if you take low traffic neighbourhoods as an example. I think one of the things can be is that there is sometimes a feeling that there's an outcome that has been decided, which is being pushed onto a community. There's also all of those issues around the names that you give a type of intervention, and it's not a standard thing that's the same everywhere. Low traffic neighbourhood can mean lots of different things in different places, and that's what we need to be really careful with. But I think there's a question which is actually, if we're moving towards being outcome driven, it's finding the right way to engage with people to understand what are the outcomes that are important. Once you know those outcomes, you can then start to work through to think, what do we need to put in place in a strategy to deliver those outcomes? Then you can work through into the individual projects and those sorts of things. So I think there is, it's a really difficult, slightly kind of higher level, maybe more abstract conversation to have early at the beginning of a process, which is what do people who live in a certain area want it to be like in 10 years time?
Absolutely. And I think continuing on the theme around sort of bringing people with you, and that again we touched earlier in the first session around that the need for cross-departmental, whether that's sometimes at national level, but also certainly the local level. How do we get away from silo working to bring that in? And so we have had a couple of questions about highways engineers, and people, rightly raising that can be a challenge in order to get that shift in thinking. So somebody has asked around how do we, the creation or sharing of pavements, bike lanes, road space for increased cycling and walking, and of course the sort of new introduction of scooters, I think, as well. So how do we make sure that happens safely? And people have asked, are people feeling that there's a change in attitude? So Simon, I don't know if perhaps you could draw on your experiences of whether you do feel that there's a shift in some of that thinking.
I do hope there was a shift in the thinking. I'm pretty positive about things. And to come back to the Houghton example, you'll see from the photos is it didn't start with the car and then how do you sort of retrofit walking and cycling. The only direct routes, the radial routes from the hubs and the centres and the rail stations are cycleway routes. And that, they're absolutely at the heart of the circulation network for the place. Beautifully landscaped environments in the main, the tree-lined avenues, really, really lovely, and fundamentally wide enough, which I think the point about scooters and e-bikes is really important, because we've got to ensure that the space that we provide for more active modes of travel in its various forms needs to be significant enough, needs to be wide enough, and I think that's where we are now is something that is much easier to plan into new places and new neighbourhoods, but for existing towns and cities, many of which are really very constrained by with their space within streets, particularly within town centres. I think that comes back to the places themselves. The councils need to start to make decisions about where they want the priority to be. Is it active modes of travel? And Paul has very much outlined the principles that they're looking at over in Ipswich, not to get rid of the car, but not to allow it to dominate so much. And there's a real shift in how we use and prioritise, importantly, the space within our existing and new places.
Yeah, thank you. And Ed, there's a question for you around recognising that highways teams are trying to address traffic issues in centres by a range of policies, including limiting car access, and but concerns perhaps that the problems of car dependency sort of 10 miles out of the centre are being ignored. So someone's asking, are there any examples of places that you're aware of that are using your analysis and tool to actually make that link with highways and transport to try and advocate for those changes or support the implementation of those changes?
So I think there are places where through the modelling you'll be able to start to see where there are places where completely changing a mode share is really difficult, because the distances will be too big, the densities will be too low, the land use mix won't be wide enough. So there are some places where it's really difficult to change. And I think if at least you can identify those places, you can then think about how to mitigate it. And you can think about, maybe it's not about if it's impossible to get a public transport route to work, maybe what we need to do is to think about how you can get people to share cars or to get cleaner cars, or to think in a different way. There's a really, in some ways, we're locked into the built environment for a long time. So some of these changes or some of these things will be very difficult to change. One of the things that was the work in Devon that was really interesting, that was one of the NHS Healthy New Towns on Cranbrook. What was really interesting there was that was really cross-departmental. There was people from public health, planning and transport all sitting around the table at the same time. And that was really useful because it became very clear that there was very different ways of thinking about things. Public health would talk about an outcome in 10 years' time, and that would shift everybody else's way of thinking about what does this mean for the number of houses we're doing, or these kind of things. So that was really helpful. But the other thing that was really important from the public health perspective was thinking things through kind of end-to-end and systems thinking. And it's not so much just that you have a piece of infrastructure that's there, but it's, does that work for everybody? Does that work for people who are less able to less mobile, less confident, less happy to move around at night or on their own, or those sorts of things? And I think the that combined more integrated view, thinking longer term and thinking not just from the system that you're directly involved in, is really, really important. And so I think some of these questions around how do you solve car dependence, it might be through physical intervention, it might be through public transport, it might be through delivering a soft service as well. It will depend on the particular characteristics of place.
Fiona, can I just what Ed was saying, from just add 2 points. The first is, an awful lot of what we are all talking about locally with our transport engineers is actually righting the wrongs of their predecessors. So the gap between my hometown centre and my waterfront, which is but what, 8 minutes walk, I suppose, I have to cross a gyratory system that some transport engineer built goodness knows how many years ago, because it was a sort of hinterland between the two. So actually a lot of what we're doing is undoing work that we've already done, if you see what I mean. But the other point is that this somehow has all got to work economically as well. You know, it's great to have this utopian view, which I share and want, of being able to walk along tree-lined avenues and all the rest of it. But actually, somebody's got to pay for it. They've got to get a return on their investment, be they the government or the local authority. And at the end of the day, businesses have got to be able to operate within that environment. So that's why, Ed, you know, we're talking about more of a rebalancing than an anti-car process, because actually, anti-car, I don't think we could make it stack up economically, and I don't think we could get the investment for it. So we just need to be careful about how we do this. I think what I've learned from today is that I thought this was going to be hard, and I now think it's going to be even harder.
Good, that's positive. But no, Paul, you're absolutely right. And I was about, this is a perfect segue, because I'm very conscious that we did need to pick up the finance and the viability challenges of some of these, because it was raised in the first session, and I think it is really useful, Paul and Simon especially, I think, to talk about the examples that you've highlighted in your presentation. So Paul, I know you mentioned that I think it was £25 million, I think you said, that you secured from MHCLG to help deliver elements of your vision. But I wondered if you might say a little bit more about, you know, I think we're really conscious, certainly as planners, we can write plans, but that actually doesn't necessarily mean that anything gets built in practice. So how do we shift from that visionary plan for the new place and actually making it happen on the ground?
I think the important bit you said there is you start with the vision. You don't start with the projects. It's really easy to bid into government funds and say, I want to do 4 unconnected projects, and they're all fundable, aren't they? And then you end up with just 4 building sites, and nobody can understand how they knit together. And once they're actually finished, nobody understands how they were delivered at the same time. So we have started our funding applications through Town Deal, which is but one fund the government have got. You know, there are lots and lots of them. That one just suited us, with the story, the narrative, the vision, so that we could all begin to articulate what we wanted at the end. We know we won't get there 100%, but we're going to get close. We then built the projects, 11, and there are 11 of them, some I've talked to you about it, which are consistent with that, but don't fully deliver the strategy. So the job now is, in a sense, we've banked 25 million. We know those are going to be done. It's what's the next lot. And we've got a local authority here who have a property company. They're prepared to purchase problem sites. They've done so on the waterfront here. We've now got the revival fund, which is another 8 million. So, you know, it's, in a sense, I'm not convinced you start with the cash. What you have to have is a plan that attracts the cash. That's the important bit. If you start with the cash, you dilute it down into very small projects which just sit in silo.
Thank you. And Simon, I don't know if you've got any reflections again from your range of experiences.
Yeah, I mean, briefly, to use the Milton Keynes example again, I suppose it's fair to say across the country, let alone Milton Keynes developers know how to deliver in the main, fairly significant scale viable developments. The Milton Keynes example and the rapid transit system that underpins the growth going forward, I think is a very different proposition. The price tag put on the entire network for the sort of 10 cross-city primary routes was around about £1 billion to deliver the whole thing. So it's the infrastructure and the vehicles to pump prime it. ITP that we worked with the council on did a lot of work on the financing of the delivery of the rapid transit, and I think the conclusion there was the significance of the price tag and the fact that the council really has to take ownership of the delivery of the network. Is that there is a case to be made that the council do go to central government to seek some funding, not for the full £1 billion, because I think development as it comes on board will deliver local SIL tariff in Milton Keynes contributions as part of the whole. But the council really needs to pump prime that, and I think the only way to do that is the central government funding to get the first few lines away, and again just to give it that bit of impetus to get it going.
Thank you. And Ed, again, I don't know from your experience of working with various people who might have used your model and looking at specific places, whether you have reflections on how do we make this happen in practice?
Yeah, well, I think there's some difficult bits that need to be unpicked. I think one of the things which is interesting is starting to see a relationship between long-term value coming from a certain kind of urbanism, and in some ways trying to shift away from a model of development where people are very interested in delivering houses and selling them very quickly, because in some ways that has a whole series of short-term benefits without any of the longer-term costs. And so I think there's something about being able to think about being able to encourage a shift in development model, to encourage people to take a longer-term interest in think about long-term values and income developing over time, rather than getting somewhere built, selling everything, and then moving on to the next one.
Absolutely, thank you. So we've got a few minutes left before everyone has a bit of a break from their screens and some food, hopefully. But just before we wrap up, I just wanted to ask each of our panel members if they could provide one piece of advice to our audience members who might be looking at where they live and thinking about how they might make a change that would enable their local area to be more of a complete, compact neighbourhood. What would your one bit of key advice be? So Paul, perhaps if we come to you first.
I think don't assume that it is the right outcome for you. Ensure that it really will deliver real value and real change, and that it's appropriate for you. And then write it down and say it out loud. And once you've done that, try and engage the stakeholders you will need alongside you and get them to share it. If you get to that point, then actually an awful lot of the hard work is done. And it took a long while here in Ipswich. We didn't start this last week. We started this middle of last year to get to this point. All the excitement of 15 minutes and 20 minutes has come alongside it. We genuinely take a long time to get here, so it's not easy.
Yes, absolutely. I think that's a key. And again, that's come through the questions around recognising that this will be a long journey for any place. As you say, you start with the vision, but then there's quite a lot of work after that to actually make it happen. Simon, any final advice for our audience?
A little one for me. I think it's as has been mentioned through the presentations, is about understanding your particular context where you are. I see that there's quite a few observations and questions from people about more rural areas, and I think it's looking at the potential for some growth for those places to give more critical mass. So you get more critical mass, which provides the opportunity for bus services, for more facilities within the village or small town. And again, I think that goes to the heart of today's sort of discussions about the 20-minute neighbourhood, is really understand the place where you are, what you're needing to change, what you want to change, and look at how the principles might be applied. And rather than just growth for growth's sakes, is what can the place get out of that growth to improve it for all of its residents.
Thank you. Ed?
Yeah, I think it's to be really clear about the outcomes that you want to create, and then not to rush too quickly into applying what sounds like the right answer to it, but to think about develop the strategy carefully, what works to support those outcomes, and then to also decide how you're going to measure its success. Don't develop a strategy or a project and then assume it's working. Keep track of it, decide at the beginning how you're going to measure it, and then if it's not working, think about changing it and think about trying something different. But I think it's really important to be clear on what you want the outcomes to be, clear on how to get to those, how you think to get to those outcomes, and clear to monitor it and measure it.
Thank you. And I think that emphasis on outcomes is a really sort of core TCPA message as well. I know in our first session, we talked about the importance of actually thinking about how we can tackle the health and sort of improve the health for those with the poorest health at the moment, rather than just sort of carrying on, just putting in cycle lanes. I know there's a bit of that in the chat around it, because that's relatively established as an intervention, but actually that might not actually be what would address some of the challenges for some parts of the community that actually need different interventions. So I think it's a really important part of thinking about those outcomes for everybody, the whole community. And as you say, then revisiting to see if things are working, I think is quite an important message as well. We've just got a couple of minutes left. I think there's a slide which somebody will hopefully put up for me, but I must thank our speakers for this session. Thank you, Simon, Ed, and Paul. I hope people have found it useful to again hear a little bit more about specific places and how they are trying to use this concept. I must also thank Sport England, David Locke Associates and Ipswich Central again for supporting our event today. We really are most grateful. And thank you to the audience for your questions and your comments in the chat. It's really good to see people are so engaged with this topic, and rightly, I think, challenging some of it, because as we said right at the beginning of this morning, we recognise that the elements of the concept are relatively simple, but it's not necessarily an easy thing to actually make happen on the ground. So we do really value your input and constructive challenge. In terms of practicalities, we will now have a break until our third and final session for this conference, which will start at 2 o'clock. As before, you can leave your Zoom running, or if you do want to remove yourself from Zoom, you should be able to get back into the afternoon session using the same link. I must also say that, as I mentioned before, the TCPA is a charity. We are relatively small, and if you like what we do and are more interested in finding out more about what we do, please do consider joining. There's a link on the screen. And also we have a number of upcoming TCPA events which you might be interested in attending, some of which are free, but some are paid to attend. So that, as you will see, again, lots of interesting things about visionary placemaking and successful new communities. So no doubt continuing lots of the themes that we're picking up in today's event. But thank you for your active involvement. Thank you again to our speakers and sponsors. And I hope as many of you as possible will join us for our afternoon session, which will start at 2 o'clock. Thank you.